When my wife asked, "Why don't you want me anymore? Why do you look at me like I'm a stranger in my own house?" She was close enough that I could feel the heat of her breath and the tremor in her fingers as she gripped my wrist. And the worst part was that my body still knew the outline of her, still remembered the old reflex to pull her in and smooth the panic out of her with my mouth. She wore the thin gray sweater I used to like because it clung in the right places without trying too hard, and her eyes had that glassy shine people get when they are one bad answer away from falling apart, and she tried to make it sound like a simple question, like I was the one who woke up broken. She kept searching my face as if she could find a softer version of me hiding somewhere behind my mouth, and when she didn't, she tightened her grip and said, "Please don't do that thing where you go quiet and act like I'm not even here, because I'm right here. I'm your wife, and you're treating me like I disgust you." The lamp in the corner made her skin look warm and familiar, and for a second I could almost hear the older version of us laughing in this same room. But the memory didn't comfort me anymore, because now it felt like a clip from somebody else's life. If you're reading this like a normal person, you're probably expecting the part where I say I caught her cheating. I threw a suitcase at the door, and we screamed until the neighbors called someone. But real life doesn't land like that because betrayal rarely shows up with lipstick on a collar and a dramatic soundtrack. Betrayal is quieter. It's the slow shift in habits that makes you doubt your own memory. It's the way her stories started changing depending on who was listening. It's the sudden interest in my schedule that didn't feel like care. It felt like management. It's the phone that never leaves her hand, the screen that always tilts away, the new girls' nights that come with a specific kind of perfume and a too bright smile, and it's the way she'd come home and try to hug me before she'd even taken her coat off, like she needed to coat herself in me to look innocent. I was the guy who handled things, the calm husband, the one who paid the bills on time and fixed the leaky faucet and remembered her mom's birthday. And I liked that identity because it made life stable. But stability can turn into blindness if you mistake peace for truth. The closer she got to whatever she was doing, the harder she tried to keep me pleasant. And it was almost funny in a bitter way, because she didn't realize that when someone starts performing love like a job, it stops feeling like love and starts feeling like pressure. The sexual tension part didn't disappear overnight, because attraction is stubborn and the body is loyal to old memories even when the mind is catching up. And she used that loyalty like a tool once she felt me slipping away. There were nights she'd brush past me in the hallway in just a towel and let it linger like an invitation. And there were mornings she'd slide onto my lap at the kitchen counter with coffee breath and a fake sleepy smile like we were newlyweds again. And I'd feel that old pull in my stomach before the newer feeling stepped in, the one that made me cautious instead of hungry. She noticed the difference, and that's when the questions started showing up more and more, dressed up as concern, dressed up as insecurity, dressed up as romance. And every time she asked it, she was really asking something else. She was asking whether I knew, whether I had proof, whether she still had time. So when she said it on the couch, with her fingers on my wrist and her voice trying to sound wounded instead of scared, I smiled, not because I was amused, but because I finally understood that she wasn't confused about me. She was terrified of herself being seen. I kept my voice even, and I said, "You keep asking why I don't want you, and you keep acting like desire is a switch you can flip if you say the right words. But you and I both know that's not what's happening, because you've been living like someone who's waiting to get caught." She went still in that way people do when the air changes, and she forced a laugh that didn't match her eyes, and she whispered, "I don't know what you mean. You're scaring me. Just tell me what you think you know." And I held her gaze long enough that her smile started to shake, and I said, "I know. People always say you never really know someone, but that's not true in the way they mean it, because you can know someone deeply and still misunderstand what that knowledge is doing to you. And when I look back now at the version of myself she married, I can see how easy it was for her to mistake my steadiness for simplicity. I was the man who listened without interrupting, the man who remembered details because details mattered to me, the man who learned the exact pressure she liked on her shoulders after work and the way her breathing changed when she was about to cry but didn't want to admit it. And I built our life the same way I built everything else. Slowly, deliberately, with an eye on what could go wrong before it ever did. Friends used to joke that I was too calm, that nothing rattled me, that I was the kind of husband people pointed at when they wanted to shame their own partners. And she would smile at those comments with a pride that felt earned, because I made her life easier, smoother, safer, and I liked that role because it gave me purpose and it gave me control without having to raise my voice or close my fists. What she never understood was that calm is not the absence of awareness, it is the result of it, and every quiet habit I had was a place where information settled and stayed. I remember one night early on when she was lying across my chest, tracing lazy circles on my arm, and she said in a soft, admiring voice that she loved how I always seemed to know what was happening before it happened, how I could read rooms and people and moods like I had some private map, and I joked back that someone had to pay attention if we wanted things to work. That line stayed with me later because paying attention is a skill that sharpens with use, and over time it stopped being just about us and started becoming about patterns, about how her affection would spike after certain phone calls, about how she'd pick fights right before important days for me, and then apologize with an intensity that felt rehearsed, about how she'd praise my ambition in public and quietly undermine it in private by planting doubts that sounded like concern. I didn't confront her then because I didn't feel betrayed yet. I felt curious, and curiosity can be more dangerous than anger because it doesn't rush to resolve itself. Instead, I started writing things down, not because I planned revenge at that point, but because I needed a place to put the noise so I could keep functioning like the husband everyone expected me to be. The notebook started as something harmless, tucked into the back of my work bag, and the entries were small observations written in the same neat hand I used for meeting notes. Things like dates, phrases she repeated verbatim weeks apart, sudden shifts in tone when certain names came up, and it felt almost ridiculous at first, like I was overthinking a marriage instead of living it. Still, once you start tracking reality instead of trusting the version you're handed, it becomes hard to stop, because the act itself is grounding, and I noticed that the more I wrote, the calmer I felt, as if acknowledging the truth privately gave me permission to stay composed publicly. She would kiss me goodbye in the mornings and tell me how lucky she was to have someone so stable, so reliable, and I would smile and tell her that we were a team, and the words weren't a lie yet, even if the meaning was already shifting. Desire didn't disappear during this time, because attraction doesn't care about spreadsheets or notes, and there were nights when her body pressed against mine and the old chemistry sparked. But even then there was a part of me watching, cataloging, noticing how intimacy had started to feel like reassurance instead of connection, like she needed to feel wanted to quiet something inside her, rather than because she wanted me. What makes this part hard to explain to people is that I wasn't miserable during those months. I was effective, and there is a strange comfort in effectiveness when your emotional world starts to feel unstable. I cooked, I cleaned, I listened to her complain about coworkers and friends with the same attentive nod I always had, and I gave advice that was thoughtful and measured, and she leaned on me the way someone leans on a structure they assume will always hold. Sometimes she would study my face while I talked, like she was checking for cracks, and when she didn't find any, she'd relax, unaware that strength doesn't always announce itself the way weakness does. The notebook grew thicker, the patterns clearer, and a quiet line formed in my mind between what she said and what she did. And I didn't cross that line with accusation because once you accuse, you lose the advantage of watching people reveal themselves. By the time she started to sense that something had changed in me, by the time she started asking why I seemed distant, even when I was sitting right beside her, I had already stopped seeing myself as the perfect husband she thought she had, and started seeing myself as someone who was preparing to understand the full shape of the story before deciding what to do with it. The first visible crack wasn't anger or confession, it was exhaustion, the kind that settles into someone's bones when they are running two versions of their life at the same time and can't remember which one they're in when they wake up. She stopped sleeping through the night and started roaming the house at odd hours, padding into the kitchen at 2 in the morning and pretending she was thirsty while watching me like I might suddenly sit up and accuse her, and I'd feel her eyes on my back even when I didn't turn around. That heavy, expectant stare people get when they're waiting for punishment. During the day, she became restless in a different way, touching me more often but with a sharpness that wasn't there before. Like every kiss was a test she needed to pass to prove something to herself. And when I didn't respond the way I used to, she'd pull back and search my face with a tight smile that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. She kept asking if I was okay, if work was stressing me out, if I was mad at her for something she couldn't quite name. And each question was really a probe, a way of measuring how close I was to saying the thing she was trying not to imagine. The sexual tension in the house thickened into something uncomfortable, because desire mixed with suspicion creates a kind of static that never fully discharges. And there were nights she'd crawl into bed wearing nothing but one of my shirts, letting her hand wander across my chest as if muscle memory alone could drag me back into the version of us where none of this existed. I won't pretend I didn't feel it, because I did, and the familiar pull of her body still worked on me in ways that surprised and annoyed me. But underneath it, there was a growing sense of distance that no amount of skin could bridge. When I didn't initiate, she would escalate, pressing herself closer, whispering things she knew used to get a reaction. And when that still didn't work, she'd roll away sharply and lie rigid on her side of the bed, breathing just loudly enough for me to hear how hurt she wanted me to think she was. The next morning she'd act embarrassed, overly sweet, making my coffee just the way I liked it, and kissing my cheek before I left, as if the night before had never happened. And that whiplash between seduction and shame was the clearest sign yet that something inside her was unraveling. Eventually, the half-confessions started slipping out, not all at once, but in careful, calculated pieces that she could pull back if needed. And the first one came on a Sunday afternoon when we were folding laundry together, and she suddenly said, in a voice that tried to sound casual but landed brittle, that sometimes she worried she wasn't a good wife because she felt lonely even when she wasn't alone. She watched me closely as she said it, waiting for reassurance or accusation, and when I simply nodded and said that feeling lonely didn't make someone bad, it just meant something needed attention, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath underwater. A few days later, she upped the ante, telling me she'd been texting an old friend more than she should have because it made her feel seen, quickly adding that it wasn't physical, that it didn't mean anything, that she cut it off as soon as she realized it was inappropriate. And again she paused, eyes flicking to my mouth as if expecting an explosion. I gave her nothing but quiet acknowledgement, and that restraint did more damage to her composure than yelling ever could, because guilt thrives on reaction and starves without it. By the time she asked me outright why I seemed so distant, her nerves were frayed enough that the question came out sharp instead of soft, and she accused me of punishing her without telling her what she'd done wrong, pacing the living room and throwing her hands up as if I were the unreasonable one. She said things like, "If you're mad at me, just say it, because this silence is worse than anything." And, "I can't fix something if I don't know what you think is broken." And there was a tremor in her voice that gave away how much she needed me to react so she could orient herself again. I listened the way I always had, calmly, attentively, and when she finally stopped talking, I told her that I wasn't punishing her and that I wasn't confused either, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if I'd admitted to either. She stared at me for a long moment, then asked, almost pleading, "Do you think I'm hiding something from you?" And when I met her eyes and didn't answer right away, she flinched because in that silence she could hear all the things she hadn't said out loud. From that point on, her guilt stopped being an internal storm and started spilling into everything she did, because once someone suspects they're being seen clearly, every action becomes a potential tell, and she began over-explaining where she'd been, who she'd seen, why she was late, stacking details on top of each other until they sounded rehearsed. She'd cry unexpectedly, apologize for things I hadn't accused her of, and then pull herself together quickly, watching to see if the tears had moved me the way they used to. I kept writing, kept observing, kept responding with a calm that felt almost cruel in its steadiness, and I could see the realization forming behind her eyes that Whatever she was trying to control had already slipped out of her hands. By the time she finally asked me, in that quiet, trembling voice, why I didn't seem to want her anymore, I understood that the question wasn't about desire at all. It was about exposure, and I was ready to let her sit with that fear a little longer before the story moved forward. The neighbor entered our life the way harmless things often do, quietly, and with just enough usefulness to feel welcome. And if I hadn't already been watching the edges of my world more closely than most people do, I might have missed how neatly he slid into place. He was recently divorced, mid-40s, the kind of man who kept his lawn trimmed and his voice friendly, who waved with a beer in his hand on warm evenings and asked questions that sounded polite but lingered just a little too long. He offered help before anyone asked for it, tools I didn't need, advice I hadn't requested, and when my wife talked about him, she always used the same tone she reserved for safe people, casual and dismissive in a way that suggested she didn't want me paying attention. She'd say things like, "He's just lonely since the divorce. You know how people get." And she'd laugh softly as if that explained everything, and I would nod along while filing away the fact that she never used that tone for people who truly meant nothing to her. The first real interaction I remember came one evening when he knocked on our door with a package that had been misdelivered, smiling broadly and apologizing too much as if the moment itself mattered more than the errand. And my wife lit up in a way that was small but unmistakable, her shoulders loosening, her voice lifting half a register as she thanked him. He looked at her like a man appreciating a painting he'd seen before, not staring outright, but letting his gaze linger with familiarity. And when he finally turned to me, his eyes held curiosity rather than competition, as if he were measuring something quietly. He talked about the neighborhood, about how nice it was to live near good people, and when he said it, he looked directly at my wife, and I watched the exchange with interest rather than jealousy, because jealousy assumes loss, and I was still gathering information. After he left, she moved through the house with an energy that hadn't been there earlier, humming to herself while she washed dishes. And when I asked casually what she thought of him, she shrugged and said, "He's fine. Just another divorced dad trying to be friendly. Too quickly, too neatly." And then she changed the subject before the question had fully landed. Over the following weeks, his presence became more consistent, more woven into the background of our routines, because he had a reason for everything. A ladder he needed to borrow, a fence he wanted to discuss, a casual invitation to join him for a drink that always seemed to land when I was busy. My wife started mentioning him in passing, little anecdotes that sounded harmless on their own, but added up to something more intentional, like the way she'd say, "He asked about you today," while watching my face for a reaction, or, "He said you seem like a solid guy," with a smile that felt practiced. I noticed how she dressed differently when she knew she'd run into him. Nothing dramatic, just a little more attention paid to her hair, a little more care in her movements, and when I didn't comment, she seemed both relieved and unsettled. One night, after a neighborhood gathering where he'd hovered close enough to her to feel familiar, but not close enough to be obvious, she asked me, in a voice meant to sound playful but edged with anxiety, "You don't mind that he's around so much, do you? Because I don't want things to be awkward between neighbors." And I told her that I trusted her judgment, which was true in a narrow sense and deeply untrue in the way that mattered. What struck me most was how the story seemed too obvious, how neatly it fit the shape people expect when marriages start to crack, because the lonely neighbor, the restless wife, the distant husband form a narrative so familiar it barely needs explaining. Friends would have nodded knowingly if I'd told them, offered advice I didn't ask for, encouraged confrontation or forgiveness depending on their own histories, and maybe that's why I didn't feel the rush to name him as a rival, because something about the simplicity of it all felt wrong. I watched him laugh with her from across the yard, watched her lean in just slightly when he spoke, and instead of anger, I felt a tightening focus, because whatever was happening between them was not the origin of the rot, it was just where it had found air. When I looked at him, I didn't see a man stealing my wife. I saw a man stepping into a space that had been prepared long before he arrived, and I understood then that if I wanted the truth, I couldn't rush to confront the most visible piece of it, because the most visible piece is almost never the most important one. The confession didn't happen the way movies train you to expect, because there was no dramatic collapse or sudden flood of truth, just a slow, grinding surrender that came after she realized her usual tools weren't working anymore. It started late one night when she sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched, staring at the same spot on the wood like it might open up and swallow her. She said she couldn't live with the tension anymore, that the way I watched her without reacting felt worse than anger, that she needed to know where we stood, and when I didn't interrupt, she took that as permission to keep going. She told me she'd made a mistake, that she'd crossed a line she never meant to cross, and when she finally said his name out loud, it sounded smaller than I expected, like the word itself had already lost its power. She explained how it started as conversations, how she felt seen and listened to, how it didn't feel real at first because it happened in stolen moments and careful gaps, and she kept emphasizing that it hadn't meant anything, that it was about feeling alive rather than wanting someone else. As she talked, she cried in a controlled way, stopping herself just short of losing composure, because she needed me to see her remorse without seeing her unravel completely. I let her speak until she ran out of justifications, until the silence grew heavy enough that she started filling it again, apologizing, promising, swearing she would do whatever it took to fix things. And when she finally looked at me directly, her eyes were red and pleading in a way that used to undo me. She reached for my hand and said that she understood if I was angry, that she understood if I needed time, but that she couldn't stand not knowing what I was thinking anymore. And she asked me, almost desperately, if this was why I didn't want her, if this was the thing that had changed everything between us. I watched her face carefully as I pulled my hand back, not roughly, just enough to create space, and I could see the calculation behind her fear, the relief she was already preparing to feel once the worst was out in the open. She expected grief or rage or heartbreak, some reaction that would anchor her back in familiar territory, and when I didn't give her that, she frowned, confused, and asked me again if I had heard what she just said. That was when I told her that I had heard every word, and that her affair was not the revelation she thought it was, and the look on her face shifted instantly from remorse to something closer to panic. She asked what I meant, her voice rising slightly as she said she was finally being honest, finally laying everything out, and she needed me to meet her there. I leaned back in my chair and told her, calmly and without raising my voice, that what she'd just confessed explained her behavior, but it didn't explain the beginning of it, and that the thing she was afraid I'd discovered wasn't the thing I was talking about. She stared at me, trying to read my expression, and said, "If it's not that, then what could possibly be worse?" And for the first time since this started, she sounded genuinely lost rather than defensive. I told her that the affair was a symptom, not the disease, and that I had been paying attention long before she ever touched him, and her hands started to shake as the implications settled in. She accused me then, not of cheating or neglect, but of being cruel, of holding something over her without saying it, of playing games with her emotions, and there was a sharp edge to her voice that cut through the tears. She said it wasn't fair to pretend I was fine while secretly building a case against her, that marriages weren't courtrooms, and love wasn't evidence, and I listened until she burned herself out, until the anger collapsed back into fear. When she finally asked me what I thought I knew, I told her that I knew enough to understand that the story she'd been telling herself about our marriage had never matched her actions, that the choices she made weren't sudden or accidental, and that the affair was just the part she'd been preparing to justify. She whispered my name like she was asking for mercy, and I could see in her eyes that she was starting to realize this wasn't a confrontation she could cry her way through. The moment that broke her came quietly, when I told her that I wasn't saying any of this to punish her or to hear more apologies, and that I wasn't interested in debating timelines or intentions, because the truth I was dealing with existed before all of that. She asked me, in a small, strained voice, when I had started thinking this way, when I had stopped believing in us, and I told her that belief hadn't disappeared. It had been replaced with clarity. I said that I knew before she ever touched him, and the color drained from her face as she realized the ground she thought she was standing on had never been solid at all. What she didn't understand yet, what she couldn't afford to understand, was that the affair only mattered to me as proof of a pattern I had already mapped. And when I finally started speaking, it wasn't to accuse her of sleeping with another man, but to dismantle the version of herself she had been hiding behind. I told her that I knew she hadn't married me because she loved me in the way she liked to describe to her friends, but because I represented safety at a moment when her life felt like it was slipping out of her control, and I reminded her of conversations from years ago that she thought had vanished into the air, comments she'd made about needing someone dependable, someone solid, someone who would never leave even if she didn't feel sparks every day. As I spoke, I watched the recognition spread across her face slowly, like a bruise surfacing, because she remembered saying those things, and she remembered believing they were harmless, and now she could hear them reframed as admissions rather than romantic pragmatism. She tried to interrupt, to say that love grows and changes and that choosing stability wasn't a crime, but I asked her to listen the way I had listened to her for years, and the request landed heavier than any raised voice could have. I told her about the moments she'd tried to quietly clip my ambition without ever openly opposing it, the way she framed her doubts as concern when I talked about taking risks at work, the subtle discouragement that always arrived just before I had to make a decisive move. I reminded her of the times she'd said things like, "I just don't want you to get hurt," or, "What if you fail and it ruins us?" and how those words always came wrapped in affection, making it hard to call them what they were, which was an attempt to keep me manageable. She shook her head, tears spilling freely now, insisting that she was only scared, that she was trying to protect our life together, and I told her that protection becomes control when it consistently points in one direction. I explained that I hadn't resented her for it at first, because people are complicated and fear does strange things, but over time it became impossible to ignore how often her fear aligned perfectly with her comfort, and how rarely it considered what I wanted for myself. The hardest part for her to hear came next, because it stripped away the last excuse she had been clinging to, and I told her that I knew about the period when she had seriously considered leaving me, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, calculated one that involved planning rather than emotion. I described the messages she'd sent to a friend during a breakdown she thought I'd never learn about. Messages where she talked about needing a different life, about feeling trapped by the image of the good marriage she'd helped create, and about how staying with me felt easier than facing the consequences of starting over. Her face crumpled when she realized I wasn't guessing, that I was recalling specific phrases, specific fears she'd believed were safely contained in someone else's inbox, and she asked me how I could know something she never told me. I told her that people leave traces everywhere, not just in messages, but in behavior, in timing, in the way their energy shifts when they've already made a decision internally and are just waiting for permission to act on it. She accused me then of digging through her past, of violating her privacy, of holding her worst moments against her, and there was a bitterness in her voice that came from realizing she no longer had the moral high ground she'd been trying to stand on. I let her say it all. Let her frame herself as someone who had struggled and made mistakes rather than someone who had chosen convenience over honesty. And when she finally ran out of breath, I told her that the betrayal I was talking about wasn't a single act or a single lie, but a sustained way of living where she benefited from my stability while quietly resenting it. I said that the affair with the neighbor was just the moment when the imbalance tipped far enough that it became visible, and that if it hadn't been him, it would have been someone else, because the conditions had been in place long before he arrived. By the time I finished, the room felt smaller, heavier, as if the truth itself took up space, and she sat there staring at me like she was seeing a stranger rather than a husband. She asked me, in a voice stripped of defensiveness, whether I had ever really been happy with her, and I answered honestly that I had been happy with the version of us that existed when I believed we were choosing each other for the same reasons. I told her that happiness doesn't survive long when one person is negotiating terms they never disclose, and that what finally broke something in me wasn't the affair, but the realization that she had been living a parallel emotional life while letting me believe we were aligned. She covered her face with her hands and whispered that she didn't know how to fix something that deep, and I told her quietly that I wasn't sure fixing it was the point anymore, because understanding it had already changed everything. She asked me to listen to her side the way I always had, and there was something almost rehearsed in the way she said it, as if she'd been practicing the speech for a long time in case this moment ever arrived. And I agreed, not because I owed it to her, but because I wanted to see how she understood herself when there was nowhere left to hide. She sat on the edge of the couch instead of beside me, creating a careful distance that made her feel safer, and she started talking about feeling invisible in our marriage, about how my steadiness had begun to feel like indifference, and how she told herself that my calm meant I didn't need her the way she needed me. She said she had spent years shrinking her own wants because she didn't know how to ask for more without sounding ungrateful, and that the image of us as the perfect couple became a cage she felt responsible for maintaining even when it stopped fitting. As she spoke, she painted herself as someone slowly suffocating under expectations she never explicitly challenged, and there were moments where the story almost worked, where I could hear the version of her that believed loneliness justified secrecy. She described meeting the neighbor as a moment of relief rather than temptation, explaining how easy it felt to talk to someone who didn't already know her role in the story, someone who saw her as a woman instead of a wife, and she insisted that the attention hadn't been planned or hunted, that it had simply arrived when she felt weakest. She talked about the way he listened without offering solutions, how his curiosity felt flattering after years of being predictable, and she admitted that the sexual tension made her feel alive in a way she'd missed, not because I was lacking, but because she had stopped recognizing herself. She kept repeating that it hadn't started as betrayal, that it started as survival, and she watched me carefully to see if those words landed, if they softened my expression, or shifted my posture the way they used to. There was an honesty in her voice that was convincing on the surface, and I understood how someone hearing only her version would nod along and call it complicated rather than wrong. What unsettled me were the small inconsistencies that crept in when she tried to explain timing, the way she spoke about feeling trapped while also admitting she had options she never explored, and how she framed my ambition as absence while enjoying the life it built. She said she felt controlled by my expectations, but she couldn't name a single time I had actually restricted her, only moments where she assumed what I wanted and acted accordingly without ever checking. She claimed she stayed because she was afraid of hurting me, but she didn't explain how secrecy was kinder than honesty, and when I asked her why she never spoke up before crossing lines, she admitted she liked being admired too much to risk conflict. Those pauses, those slight stumbles in the narrative, revealed the gap between how she wanted to be seen and what she had actually done, and I could feel her frustration growing as she realized I wasn't going to rescue her story by filling in the blanks with sympathy. By the end of it, her version of events sounded less like a confession and more like a defense brief, carefully constructed to preserve her self-image while acknowledging just enough wrongdoing to appear accountable. She told me she never meant to hurt anyone, that she didn't think things through, that she was just trying to feel okay in a life that felt increasingly foreign, and I believed that she believed it, which was the most unsettling part of all. When she finished, she looked at me with exhausted hope, as if laying it all out might reset the balance between us, and she asked if I could understand how she ended up there without deciding she was a terrible person. I told her that understanding her perspective didn't require me to accept her conclusions, and that empathy didn't erase impact, and the silence that followed was heavy with the realization that her story, no matter how carefully told, could not undo the choices that had already set everything else in motion. The first time I really noticed his daughter was the moment everything shifted from uncomfortable to unmistakably wrong, because she didn't behave like a teenager annoyed by adults or bored by her surroundings. She behaved like someone constantly measuring exits. She stood a little behind him whenever he brought her along, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes scanning the ground, and then the faces around her in quick, efficient movements that reminded me of someone used to anticipating moods rather than expressing their own. She couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, tall for her age but trying to make herself smaller, and when our eyes met she looked away instantly, as if eye contact itself was a risk. My wife noticed her too, but in a different way, with a stiffness that felt forced, and she spoke to her with an exaggerated brightness that landed wrong, the kind of tone adults use when they are overcorrecting for discomfort. It happened during one of those casual backyard gatherings neighbors host when they want to feel social without committing to intimacy, and he brought his daughter along because, as he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, she was too old for babysitters and too young to be left alone. She hovered near the fence while the rest of us talked, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, and when my wife approached her with a drink and asked if she was enjoying herself, the girl flinched almost imperceptibly before answering politely. There was a moment then, brief but sharp, when her eyes flicked up to my wife's face with something like recognition, not confusion or curiosity, but a startled awareness that made my stomach tighten. My wife didn't notice it, or pretended not to, but I did, and once you see something like that, you can't unsee it, because recognition doesn't appear without history. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention to the girl in a way that felt instinctive rather than intentional, noticing how she avoided being alone with her father whenever possible, how she positioned herself near other adults or lingered close to open doors. When he spoke to her, his hand would settle on her shoulder a little too firmly, a little too long, and she would go still under it, her body reacting before her face did. My wife avoided looking at them together, always turning her attention elsewhere when he called his daughter over or corrected her sharply, and that avoidance spoke louder than anything she said. One afternoon, when the neighbor asked me to help him with something in his garage, the girl was sitting on the steps outside our house, pretending to scroll on her phone while clearly waiting for someone to notice her, and when I asked if she was okay, she nodded quickly, then hesitated, as if unused to being asked questions that didn't come with strings attached. We talked in fragments at first, about school, about how boring the neighborhood was, about how she liked the quiet at our place because it felt different, and there was a cautious warmth in her voice that surfaced only when she realized I wasn't pushing for anything more. She asked about my work, about how long I'd lived here, about whether I'd always been married, and when she asked that last question, she watched my face closely, as if my answer might confirm something she already suspected. At one point she said, almost casually, that my wife used to look different, that she remembered her from somewhere else, and when I asked what she meant, she shrugged and said she wasn't sure, that it was probably nothing, but her tone suggested otherwise. That comment settled into my mind and refused to leave, because children rarely invent recognition without cause, and the way she said it carried the weight of something she didn't yet know how to articulate. The shift in me was subtle but immediate, because whatever resentment or anger I felt toward my wife no longer occupied the center of the story once I started seeing the edges of something darker forming around this girl. I found myself instinctively positioning myself between her and her father during gatherings, offering excuses to keep her occupied elsewhere, and watching how her posture changed when she realized she wasn't alone. She responded to that presence in small ways, standing a little straighter, speaking a little more freely, and once, when her father snapped at her for interrupting, she looked at me instead of shrinking back, and there was a flash of relief in her eyes that cut deeper than any accusation could have. It was then that I understood my role in this story had shifted again, because whatever I had been preparing for with my wife and the neighbor was no longer just about betrayal or revenge, but about responsibility, and the realization that some truths, once seen, refused to stay secondary. The truth surfaced the way buried things often do, not through confrontation but through accumulation, because once you start noticing how stories overlap, the gaps begin to glow. It started with a comment the girl made one afternoon while sitting at our kitchen table, her backpack on the floor, and her shoulders finally relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before, when she mentioned a town my wife used to live in years ago, a place she rarely talked about and always dismissed as a forgettable phase. The girl said the name without thinking, then froze as if she'd stepped onto thin ice, and when I asked how she knew it, she shrugged too quickly and said her dad had friends there once, which didn't explain the flicker of fear that crossed her face. That night, after she'd gone home, I went back through the notes I'd been keeping for years, not just about my wife, but about timelines, moves, financial stress she'd downplayed, and the sudden appearance of help she never fully explained. The pattern tightened in a way that made my chest feel hollow, because the dates lined up too cleanly to ignore, and the recognition in the girl's eyes suddenly had a place to land. When I finally asked my wife about that period of her life, I didn't accuse her. I just asked questions the way I always had, calmly and patiently, and watched how her body reacted before her words caught up. She tried to brush it off at first, saying it was a hard time and she didn't like revisiting it. But when I mentioned the neighbor's name in the same breath as that town, the color drained from her face in a way that no affair confession ever produced. She told me I was imagining connections, that desperation makes people see conspiracies, and when I didn't push back immediately, when I simply waited, she started talking faster, offering explanations that contradicted things she'd told me years ago. Finally, when the silence stretched too long for her to fill, she broke, and the story spilled out in pieces she couldn't fully control, about needing money badly, about being afraid, about being asked for help with something she didn't want to understand. She never used explicit words, never named the thing directly, but she didn't have to, because the way she described looking the other way, vouching for him when questions were raised, and accepting his help in return formed a picture that made my hands curl into fists under the table. She insisted she hadn't known the full extent of what was happening, that she'd convinced herself it was exaggerated, that she was protecting a family rather than enabling harm, and as she spoke I could hear how carefully she'd rewritten the past to survive it. She said she'd told herself she had no power, that she was just one person trying to get through a crisis, and that the guilt had followed her ever since, shaping her choices in ways she didn't fully understand. The affair, she admitted through tears, hadn't just been about feeling wanted, it had been about proximity, about keeping something buried by staying close to it, about convincing herself that whatever happened back then was over and safely contained. Listening to her, I felt a cold clarity settle in, because this was the thing she'd been running from all along, the truth she couldn't afford to have dragged into the light, and it explained every frantic attempt to control the narrative, every effort to keep me distracted or diminished. The final confirmation came quietly, from the girl herself, in a moment that still sits heavy in my chest, when she told me, in halting sentences and careful language, that she knew my wife from before, that she remembered her being there when she tried to ask for help and being told not to make trouble. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize, she just stated it as a fact, and the restraint in her voice made it impossible to dismiss. In that moment, the story snapped into focus with a precision that left no room for doubt, and I understood that when I'd told my wife I knew, I hadn't just been talking about betrayal or lies, or even the affair that had obsessed her. I had known something much heavier was sitting underneath all of it, something that connected her choices to a harm that never stopped echoing, and I realized that whatever came next wasn't about punishment for its own sake, but about bringing a truth into the open that had been protected for far too long. By the time everything came into the open, the house felt different, not quieter or calmer, but settled, like the moment after a long storm when the air finally stops pressing down on your lungs, and I could see in my wife's movements that she sensed it too, that the waiting she'd been doing without admitting it was over. I didn't announce what I'd done or lay out a grand reveal, because real endings rarely come with speeches. They come with logistics, paperwork, conversations held behind closed doors where voices stay measured because emotions would only get in the way. The evidence had been collected slowly and carefully, timelines cross-checked, statements documented, patterns confirmed by people whose jobs depended on precision rather than drama. And when the authorities finally stepped in, it wasn't with flashing lights or public spectacle. It was with quiet certainty that left no room for denial. The neighbor tried to posture at first, tried to charm his way through it the same way he'd charmed his way through everything else. But charm collapses quickly when it's asked to explain facts instead of impressions, and watching that happen felt less like revenge and more like gravity finally doing its work. The girl was removed from his custody on a weekday afternoon, escorted with a gentleness that made my chest ache. And when she looked back at the house, she didn't look frightened or confused. She looked relieved in a way that didn't need words. She didn't cry or thank anyone. She just took a deeper breath than I'd ever seen her take before, and that single breath felt heavier than all the arguments that had led up to this point. My wife watched from the window, arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and rigid as if she were trying to hold herself together by force alone. And when she finally turned to me, her voice sounded small and raw as she asked how long I'd been planning this, how long I'd known what I was going to do. I told her the truth, that there hadn't been a single moment where I decided on an endgame, only a series of decisions to keep paying attention, to keep choosing clarity over comfort, and that once the shape of the truth was clear, the next steps followed naturally. She asked if I hated her, if this was all some elaborate punishment designed to destroy her, and I told her that hatred requires energy I no longer had for her, that what I felt was something closer to finality. She sat down hard on the couch then, as if her legs had given out under the weight of it all, and she said she never thought it would come to this, that she believed if she kept everything balanced just well enough it would stay buried, and there was a desperation in her voice that almost sounded like awe. She asked me finally, the question she should have asked at the beginning, when did I know? And for a moment I studied her face, the familiar angles softened by fear, the person I once loved, and the person who had made choices that changed everything occupying the same space. I smiled then, not out of cruelty or triumph, but because the answer had been with me for a long time, steady and clear, and I told her that I knew before she ever asked why I stopped wanting her, that I knew before the affair, before the neighbor, before the panic set in, back when the first small inconsistencies appeared, and I chose to observe instead of confront. The smile wasn't for her, it was for myself, because in that moment I understood that revenge isn't always loud or messy. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you didn't look away when it mattered, and that the truth, once seen and acted on, has a way of standing on its own without needing your anger to prop it up.